look at third day on civil rights, and this is going to be 1958 after that Little Rock 9 incident we had there, all the way up to 1964, culminating with the Civil Rights Act. And so let's just delve into this, okay? The first thing we have is that in 1958, and it's been going on for a while, but in 1958, there is a bombing in Birmingham, and for this reason, Birmingham earns the nickname of Bombingham. And what happens here is this was the 16th Street Baptist Church connected to Dr. King, and 4 young black girls are killed. And so this looks very negative now. The important thing here is that the FBI, you can see a guy here, is brought in to investigate because who's bombing us, who are we afraid of in the 50s bombing us, but communists. And there's an interesting link here in a second. Now, at the same time, there was a society called the John Birch Society. They're not necessarily anti-civil rights, they are anti-communist. And so the John Birch Society was alerted to this Bombingham incident, and they came in and they did their own search, and they produced a document, and we don't know if it's true or not, what is going on, but it's going to link Dr. King to communism. And so for that reason, Dr. King will be followed around by FBI basically everywhere else he went. And the question is, how did people know about it? Well, we now know there was a snitch who basically ratted out where Dr. King would be. All right? And so here's a pamphlet of the idea of a John Birch Society, that the blacks would get better rights under communism and they could potentially fall, and Dr. King was promoting this. Now, in 1960, we have a switch. We've already had marches. We've had different things like that. But in 1960, college students have not been included, and so these 4 students here will perform the first sit-in, okay? And we'll come back to that here in a second. Now, who came up with the idea of a sit-in? It was a group called SNCC, and SNCC stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And as you can tell by their buttons, it is a white and black group. It is an interracial group. And so these are young college students, and their major method of protest was that sit-in that we saw here, okay? So, what is a sit-in? First off, it is an economic boycott. You go in to a place where you're not supposed to, and you simply refuse to buy something on the grounds of moral injustice. The next thing is it's a form of civil disobedience. You're disobeying a law you think to be unjust, and the only way to fix that is by forcibly removing them, and that looks kind of negative. And lastly, the first sit-in was in Greensboro, North Carolina, at a store that is now defunct called Woolworths. It was a department store similar to like a Macy's, something like that. Now, the sit-ins spawned many, many more. SNCC will perform many, many sit-ins. So if you remember, okay, let's kind of go back here for a minute. NAACP is using the courts. CORE did kind of big activities, big plan things. SCLC, they're going to be improvement associations, boycotts, things of that nature. And now we have SNCC, and SNCC is going to do sit-ins. A lot of different groups performing different things, and I'll come back to that here in a second. So, also in 1960, we have the second Civil Rights Act. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1960. It was basically a voting rights act, and so it's basically just going to protect a little bit of voting rights, things like that. It really didn't do much else. It was kind of maybe a ploy, I guess, if you will, to try and help Nixon to be elected, but that didn't work. Now, also in 1960, a group that had been around for a while is starting to gain steam and really, really start moving. And they are founded by a man who takes the name of Elijah Muhammad. Now, Elijah Muhammad is the founder of an organization called the Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslims. And so by him, if you'll get Nation of Islam, Black Muslims, and we'll move from there, okay? Now, what makes the Nation of Islam unique? Number one, they're kind of like the religion of Islam, okay? Number two, they wanted a separate society. So they wanted a separate society outside of that, not just white and black, but a separate nation, hence the Nation of Islam, right? And lastly, and kind of just more interestingly, I guess, if you will, if you join them, you were told to drop your slave name, which was your last name. And I'll give you an example of that here in a second. And so who do these people appeal to? Well, they appeal to young, disenfranchised black teenagers and in their 20s who are in jail. One such man was Malcolm Little. Malcolm Little, while in jail for theft and different things like that in his teens, will convert to the Nation of Islam. He will drop his last name, and he will become known as Malcolm X. And so he's the big mouthpiece of this movement. Now, what are they preaching here? What is going on? They're going to preach gaining civil rights through militant means, if that means different things like that. And so they would set up black rifle clubs where you could own a rifle if you were black, different things like that. And so that was the Nation of Islam. They are still around today, by the way. Now, in 1961, Kennedy will pass what is called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, set by the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. And this did a couple of things. First off, it was an executive order. That's basically saying, President Wynn did this. It's going to set up a commission to make sure that you're not being discriminated on because of your race. And lastly, it's going to create what we call affirmative action. And affirmative action basically is giving preference to a minority because of a past injustice. And there's a lot of questions on how that should be looked at. Now, in the second half of this, we're going to move into some stuff. Now, one thing I didn't have in here that I want to kind of talk about real quick, in 1961, there's a voter registration drive in Mississippi, and it fails. Okay, and it fails just because there wasn't enough organization, there wasn't enough cohesion or synergy. That's a big word, right? Where all the groups are working for the benefit of another. And so the first thing we'll talk about is something done to fix that, all right?